We've gone hands-on with PS5 Pro. We've taken a look at a number of games under the microscope, and we've talked about the PS5 Pro over hours and hours of content. But what we haven't done is sit down with some of the people who have made PS5 Pro and some of its software actually possible. So today I'm sitting here with Mark Cerny, the lead system architect for PS5 Pro, and Mike Fitzgerald, the core technology director at Insomniac Games, for a quick chat about the PS5 Pro. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
And when this video is published, you should be able to watch a full version of Mark Cerny's PS5 Pro presentation that I just saw in person live here at the Sony headquarters in California. So that should provide some context for what we'll be discussing here today. But I just wanted to start off here by talking about PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution. There has been a little bit of a difference in terms of approach between some developers like Naughty Dog and some other developers like, for instance, Square Enix, in terms of the kinds of modes that they're offering. So some developers are basically offering many modes, many toggles like Insomniac, whereas other developers are using PSSR as an opportunity to basically homogenize their existing modes into one ultimate PS5 Pro mode with all the high frame rate fidelity that people are looking for. So what's your kind of position on managing these two things? And do you guys have kind of a way of thinking about that or a preference for certain titles in terms of targeting those different aspects?
I mean, my preference is that the game developers do what they feel is best for their titles. So this is really a question for Mike.
Yeah, I'd say, when we make a game and we work as a whole studio and team on delivering it, we're making some really tough trade-offs between what we want to present at a higher frame rate and what we can present at the 30 frames per second lower frame rate. So the nice thing about being approached with new hardware is that suddenly those compromises we made while shipping the game go away. And so we're able to bring together a lot of what made the fidelity mode on the base PS5 and what made the performance mode on the PS5 Pro. Yep. Now, after spending some time doing that and having a really nice performance pro mode together, people's attention start to turn to, well, maybe some people still want to play at 30 frames per second. We do have this nice new piece of hardware. What other fun things can we do about it?
Yeah, so I think it probably does depend a lot on the game because for you guys, you have so much ray tracing in there that you can pack into all kinds of different configurations. Whereas I think a lot of developers are going to be in a position where it's well, we can deliver a good 4K image. Now we can deliver it at 60 FPS. Maybe that's the way to go with just one mode, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I knew there would be a lot of different strategies. I was upfront about this in that first video I did, is there were 6 games that were shown. And the first 3 is you can do the almighty mode. And then here's 3 other titles that do something completely different.
Okay, I also wanted to ask just another question about PSSR. We've seen from developers that there have been a wide range of upscaling factors that are going into this PSSR process. We've seen in a title like Alan Wake that's doing 864p to 4K. In other titles, like in the Insomniac titles, maybe it's more like 1440p or 1584p to 4K. Is there a kind of guidance that you have with regards to those upscale factors at the moment? Is there a kind of preference from the Sony team, or is it kind of roll your own, see what kind of image quality you get, and that ultimately is the thing that should decide your approach?
I'll talk a little bit about the tech we're developing, and then you can talk about how you're using it. There's a lot of research going on there. We support one mode that covers a range of 2 to 5 to 1 to 1 to 1.
Okay.
And whether that's an ideal long-term strategy or not, we're definitely talking about it. And we're looking at the low end of the range and the issues we see there versus the high end of the range. So I really wouldn't take that current 2.5 to 1 as any sort of indication about where we'll be years from now.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it depends too on what you're moving from. So the TAA that we had been leveraging as a studio and still do was really well suited for about 1440 up to 4K, but really struggled when it got down closer to 1080, 1280 in that range. And so PSSR behaves very well at that range, and for us, it's the big improvement and gives us an opportunity to spend our time differently there.
Yeah, that fur on performance RT.
Yeah, it struggled for me as a player playing at home in the performance modes that we had on the base PS5, and so to see that quality come back.
Yeah, so PSSR, it's basically your kind of first implementation here of a machine learning based upscaling model. And I think we're seeing, that for sure people are doing pretty wide ranges in terms of those upscaling factors. But in the future, are you potentially looking to even increase those upscaling factors or maybe be delivering better quality out of PSSR, out of a new version of PSSR perhaps? Like we know that so far there have been some improvements in that PSSR iteration over the time pre-launch. So will that continue in the future, do you think?
I mean, we're definitely continuing with development of these ML-based libraries for game graphics. It's just that there's so many targets to go up against. Like, I was in that talk today, I was also going over frame generation, frame extrapolation, ray tracing, denoising, and the like. So what order and what focus, those are really good questions. Additionally complicating this, of course, is that we announced Project Amethyst with AMD today. So it's not just us developing the networks. We have a partner that we're doing it with. And of course, what the partner feels about that technology direction and where the focus should be is also very important.
Okay, so in that vein, on PC at the moment, we have a lot of technologies, like you mentioned. We have frame generation. We have lots of AI upscaling models. We have people even talking like Intel about possibly frame extrapolation models. We also have models like DLSS ray reconstruction, which are doing pretty profound things to the makeup of a game image in real time in a pretty lightweight manner. So these are areas that you're possibly exploring. Is that what you're saying for future PSSR upgrades? Is that what you're thinking about?
Oh, definitely. Well, it wouldn't be PSSR. It would be, so PSSR is PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution.
So it'll be different branding. Yeah, Spectral's branding.
Spectral is our branding for the ML libraries for graphics, just like Tempest is our branding for our 3D audio.
Right.
And so it's going to be Spectral something for all of that. And we're definitely looking at what it would be that Spectral something, if not Super Resolution. But Super Resolution is a very good place to start.
Right. And then in terms of that PSSR, in terms of the way that it's implemented on a per-game basis, that's something that developers will presumably have to go and patch in new versions of PSSR, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily want new versions of PSSR kind of in the mix there without a title update, or is that something you're thinking about?
Well, there are a lot of interesting possibilities there. And I know, honestly, I don't know at this time. It's wonderful to think that the game could say it's okay to update, or a user could make a decision to update. Just how all of those pieces fit together, I don't know.
From a developer perspective, I think we can look at our games differently a lot of the time. And I know some developers would say, I don't want the system to touch what I have confirmed looks good to me and players. And other developers would say, oh, your system's going to go and make my game look better for people without me having to do anything great. So there's options there.
Yeah. I think with PSSR, a lot of people are pretty interested in a certain kind of problem, which is that you have a pretty tremendous improvement in image quality. And I think we see this across, different kinds of PC upscalers as well when we're talking about that. But the internal resolution of that imagery might not be changing that much relative to what you saw before. So are you guys kind of trying to figure out how to message that to people and tell people like this is a profoundly improved image despite the fact that the internal resolution is comparable? And I know that we're part of this problem for sure. So that's a tough thing to message. But have you thought about that?
You're not part of the problem. And I've heard you talk. I spend too much time on DF, but I've heard you talk about how you really shouldn't be looking at internal rendering resolution and drawing too much in the way of conclusions from that. You really need to be looking at image quality. And I was trying to communicate exactly the same message today, is we need to change the way we're talking about resolution. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about it at all. The difficulty is if you don't have a number, right, it gets very hard to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think we tried to get away from it at some point by just maybe stop telling the numbers and start using like some kind of model that would tell people what the approximate image quality is. Yeah. But it's a big challenge because like you're trying to communicate different things, and resolution is an important part of that at the moment at least, but that final image is ultimately what really matters to people. And I think that's what we're seeing with PSSR for sure. One last question about PSSR here. and this relates specifically to your work, Mike,
Yeah,
is that one thing we saw with PSSR in Ratchet and Clank in particular is that it appeared to improve the stability and resolve of RT reflections. Is that something that you've seen across other titles that you're working on? Obviously, you have 4 titles on PS5.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would expect would carry over to other games, possibly with RT reflections, where that PSSR process, or whatever inputs are being fed into that PSSR process, are producing a better result with PSSR?
So ray trace reflections are an interesting challenge because they are a composite of multiple images in the frame, right? That pixel that has the reflection, it's partly the window that is reflecting the thing, or the mirror. It's partly the thing that's being reflecting in the picture. And so with the information you feed into an algorithm like PSSR, you're limited in how much you can describe about that one pixel. So an example would be if you're passing the depth buffer in to tell the PSSR how far things are from the camera, it can't tell it how far the window is and how far the reflecting thing is and how far the thing behind the window, right? There's layers of this. And so that's what makes that a unique challenge is as you turn the camera, you have some velocity information about how the window is changing, but maybe not information about how the reflecting thing in the mirror is changing.
Right.
And one thing is that can be really hard to encapsulate in an analytical algorithm like TAA, where you're sort of limited in how you express that kind of thing. So I think that's one of the areas we were hoping to see improvement is PSSR in a trained model that has more capability to perhaps recognize that type of situation or adapt to it.
I'd like to move on now from PSSR onto the hardware, and maybe we can discuss some of the things we saw in the presentation indeed there as well. When designing the PS5, one thing I was struck by in the presentation is there was not as much of a kind of organizing thought, I thought, around the PS5 Pro, like kind of the why rather than the how a little bit. With PS4 Pro, it was very much like we're going to target 4K displays. Here, it seems much more like you're achieving an enormous improvement in the power level of that console. But did you have a certain kind of game experience in mind to deliver to players when you were designing this console? Or was it like, we're going to achieve big power improvements and then the developers are going to show players what that looks like?
It's a mid-generation release, so really the target is better graphics. And, it felt like the big 3 were the right things to go after. Larger GPU, more advanced ray tracing, and the ML.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, not that complex.
Yeah, it's not that complex, but I think what we've seen so far, one really compelling thing, I think, is getting those fidelity modes, those 30 FPS modes, basically at 60 FPS with comparable image quality, very comparable looking visuals overall. So that is for sure something that is sticking out in this early batch as well as ray tracing enhancements like we're seeing in the Insomniac titles.
I mean, also personally speaking, it's been just great digging into the ML aspects of this and gaining some knowledge there. Because we know that's the future we're heading into. And so what an opportunity to gain all of that knowledge with the Pro, rather than waiting for the start of a true generation and having to get everything right with no experience whatsoever.
Yeah. One interesting thing about the PS5 Pro, it's obviously being upgraded in a ton of respects. You've got improved memory, improved storage, obviously a massively improved GPU, but the CPU is staying roughly the same as we had before. Now, there is a clock bump that developers can tap into there, but it is, broadly speaking, a very comparable CPU there. Why wasn't the CPU upgraded, and why was not such a big focus there?
I mean, it's really just a question of where you put your resources. And I wasn't seeing, and I didn't think I would see, that many titles that couldn't run at 60. That's kind of my litmus test. Yeah. I'm not asking, do all the games run at 120 at this point in time? I'm asking, do all the games run at 60? And you can count the AAA exceptions on one hand, I think, for games that didn't eventually run at 60. And so it seemed if we threw pretty much all of our resources into the graphics, that would be the best approach.
Right.
I'd say as a developer, the day Mark comes and says, hey, we want to give you guys a presentation about what we're thinking about for the next hardware, like that's a fun meeting for everyone. And we were very happy with where the focus was here, GPU-wise.
Yeah. With regards to the machine learning hardware in the console, do you essentially see that as kind of a solution for a problem that we're seeing across the industry, which is that you don't get good cost scaling on new silicon nodes anymore? You aren't getting that massive driving down in the cost per transistor that's enabled us historically to increase the power of consoles. Is machine learning ultimately, is that going to be the answer to that question, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully everybody watches that video that we're talking about, because that's precisely what I was saying is rasterized rendering, and I don't have a better word for it, but the strategies that we had up through PS4 Pro or the like, that is, I wouldn't say it's reached a limit, but mostly it's about making the GPU bigger or memory faster. And so, as we look to the future, the improvements will be ray tracing. Ray tracing, I think we're going to see a lot happening there. And then everything we can get done with ML.
One last question here on the PS5 Pro hardware itself, the way that it's been configured. We seem to know roughly that you're targeting similar clocks in the GPU as in the base PS5 model. And you might have some issues possibly with running up against power constraints in this model in possibly a more significant way because the model itself has a much larger GPU. So is it the case that maybe developers will have to deal with a little bit more of a variable clock speed in that GPU?
That's a great question. It's pretty much identical. So PlayStation 5 capped at 2.23. PlayStation 5 Pro caps at 2.35, which I did not talk about in the video today because it's just such a distraction. I don't want anybody doing flop math based on 2.35 because at the end of the day, we go in and when we do the set design, we tune the set design so that the games are running at about 2.17. Right, we don't want it to get too bulky. We don't want to have the fan have to be too large or the like. So, I mean, that 2.35 is really a red herring. I don't think too many games will get up to that too often.
Okay. I just wanted to ask some more, I guess, general questions and maybe a little bit more philosophical questions possibly from this point onwards, because I think we've seen from your presentation that you have a really clear vision for what the PlayStation 5 Pro looks like. And obviously you've delivered a compelling piece of hardware there. But I do wonder a little bit about something in the presentation, which is that you kind of positioned the PS4 and the PS5, and the PS4 Pro and the PS5 Pro as existing along separate tracks. One down the left-hand track as generational leaps, and then the mid-gen refreshes on the right, the enhanced consoles. Now, we're in an era where developers are shipping cross-gen more than they ever have. But does that chart reflect that you still believe fundamentally in generational leaps, going from one generation to the next generation, big changes in software, big changes in what people can deliver on that hardware?
So we're not making PCs. We're making a few very specific things, right? How many types of PCs are there? I mean, you can't even answer that question because you can combine the components in any way you want to. Okay. So the Pro consoles are very tightly targeted. I mean, you're seeing around GPU. But when a new generation starts, then it gets opened up to what are we doing with the CPU? What are we doing with the amount of memory? What are we doing with haptics? It's a whole new experience that the developers can go out. And I think it's really helpful, even if we drop words like revolution from the conversation, I think it's really helpful if the developers have that thing to consider and can ask the question, okay, this game, yes, it'll ship on one, it'll also ship on the next, but how can it be a different creature for each of those? Not gameplay-wise, but in terms of the visual experience. Good influence.
Yeah, so for you, really that distinction, and the distinction you kind of want to maintain, is that on that enhanced side, you're talking about bigger GPUs, better graphics, that sort of thing. But on the generational side, that's when you're really trying to talk about fundamental paradigms, like how fast is my CPU? What kind of haptics do we have there? Okay, that's the kind of fundamental difference there. We are talking about an era where rasterized performance improvements are maybe not as important as they used to be back in the past when they were extremely important. And the use of upscaling technologies is changing the way that we perceive a lot of those metrics.
Well, it's not all going to be rainbows and path tracing.
Well, exactly. So along those lines, actually, the PS5 Pro still has 67% more WGPs or CUs than the outgoing PS5. So this is not like, even though this is the future possibly of graphics rendering, a massive focus on AI and ray tracing. It's not completely here today, is it? Because you have to make some of these changes.
Sure. I mean, what was that like? Because you had a moderate boost for the raw graphics performance, and then you had a much better boost for the ray tracing. How did you tweak the engine?
Well, the nice part was that those things stacked together in a really constructive way. So we were able to use the faster ray tracing performance to get some time to spend to drive the upscaler further. And this came just the more sizable GPU came back to cut frame times down. So I think they stacked well for a game that was designed for the base PS5 and already had little bits of each of those pieces. You know?
Well, I liked it because very simplistically looking at it, it's faster. And so, you've just sped up your rendering and now you have 5 milliseconds to spend on whatever. And so why not spend them on improving your ray tracing or adding a new widget or whatever? Like if you're making an engine, nobody is ever coming to you and saying, you now have 5 milliseconds to do whatever you want to do. That's just gravy, right? That doesn't happen.
It's pretty rare.
You're desperately trying to get to 60 frames per second.
Yeah, that was one thing in the presentation that I thought was quite compelling, which is you show like your 11 millisecond or your 16 millisecond workload on PS5 becomes an 11 millisecond workload on PS5 Pro. Then all of a sudden you've got this big chunk of frame time left over looking very scrumptious. And all of a sudden you can devote your resources to tackling ray tracing, to doing machine learning upscaling, doing a lot more on the hardware. I guess my last kind of round of general questions here has to do with Amethyst. So can you kind of explain the Amethyst initiative with AMD? You've discussed it already. You've mentioned it before. You talk about it a lot in the video. Can you kind of explain what the Amethyst vision is for your collaboration with AMD and what it will mean going forward?
Sure. I mean, there's two components. It's a deep collaboration. It's multi-year. I mean, don't expect, some massive hardware announcement immediately coming out of this. But there's two targets. One is better, more optimal, I should say, architectures for machine learning. And I look at that through a very narrow lens because we're making a console. And so I really want to hear about, number one, I think I want to hear about is, does it support these lightweight CNNs that we need for the graphics, right? But I'd also like to hear about, if people want to do their AI or something on it, is it something that is portable? Is it something that's easy to create? Because you never want to lock people into just one hardware architecture when they make that stuff. So working on this generalized architecture that's particularly good at the ML needs of consoles.
Yes. Okay.
I suspect AMD might frame it slightly differently, at least in priorities.
So for you guys, really, it's that focus on these really lightweight models that you're using in real-time rendering.
That's my personal focus, right? I mean, AMD, of course, is incredibly broad, and they have big machinery out in the cloud, and they have laptops. They're in so many different spaces. But I look at it as, yes, I'd love to see these things happen. And the other part of it is, for these neural networks, they're time-consuming to make. I think, with no exaggeration, PSSR is the toughest technical project I've ever been in my life. And it's just marvelous to have a partner who also has resources and expertise that can be going into very much the same targets. And what are those targets? It is super resolution. It is, I guarantee it's possible to do better than PSSR. And that's just scratching the surface of where we can head. I mean, I mentioned frame generation and the like, but there are uses I know are out there that we haven't even started talking about yet. So it's to develop those together. Now, to clarify, we're talking about developing components, not developing libraries. Because our customers are different, and when it comes down to it, the hardware is a little bit different. I hope it rung true when I was saying PCs and super resolution's a little bit different from consoles and super resolution, because we tend to be variable upscaling ratio, and PCs tend to be, it's changing, but tend to be fixed upscaling ratios. So having this ability to grab those algorithms and then integrate those co-developed algorithms and integrate separately is really going to be a boost, I think, across the board.
Yeah, it does seem like a very compelling technology partnership, especially considering that, like, on PS5 Pro, you're developing some custom hardware that looks very interesting, and possibly, a lot of those stuff that you're working on has applications to AMD and vice versa there. So I think that's a very interesting partnership. I guess one question that we do have and that we are curious about is how the hardware handles backwards compatibility. If you could answer that at all, because we know that with the PS5 Pro, it doesn't have a perfectly butterflied GPU configuration, whereas on PS4 Pro, it was a butterflied GPU configuration.
It's a great question. So we learned a lot from PS4 Pro. So going into PS4 Pro, I thought we had to replicate pretty much the exact timing that the game was running under. And it turns out you don't need to. It turns out that if the timing can drift a bit and the game will still work. I mean, there's a limit to how far that can go, and we did see a few titles, like 11, I think, that wouldn't respond well when we did PS4 Pro to the radically different timing. But in general, that's out of thousands. But in general, the games are pretty robust when it comes to the timing. So shorter answer is PS5 Pro, we just didn't worry about it. And the games are working.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's interesting because, that PS4 Pro approach definitely did guarantee that level of compatibility that you're looking for. But now it doesn't seem like it's that big of an issue.
So we need binary compatibility. So we need all of the registers that the game was hitting to be there. But we don't need whatever was taking 1,000 cycles before to still take 1,000 cycles. It's okay if it takes 600 or 900 or even occasionally 1,100.
I kind of had one other question about the hardware here. Given that the PS5 Pro seems to handle areas where RT is quite divergent a lot better than PS5, I know this generation so far we've not really seen games that use path tracing, possibly because of these fundamental issues here. Do you think that could be something that feeds into games that are using more advanced ray tracing techniques or even trying to ray trace all their lighting?
Well, I think we've already seen it. We've already seen that consistency of ray tracing performance pay off even in the Spider-Man 2 patch we've done. So we're able to put in ray traced AO. We have some ray trace shadows in there, and places where we were bumping up against those divergence limits. In fact, the water reflections in Spider-Man 2, we cheated them all so that they were less divergent than would be physically accurate in the water to sort of scrape that performance back. And so we're already seeing opportunities where it's paying off for us.
I think path tracing on PS5 Pro would be a little tricky to do. But, I wouldn't put it past the developers. There are some amazing engineers out there.
It sounds like a challenge.
Okay, great. And one final question here. What is your kind of vision for what developers will be achieving on PS5 Pro ultimately in the future? Like, what would you say in a couple years, you're looking at PS5 Pro software, what would you be happy with ultimately?
Yeah, I'm happy with the launch lineup, to be honest. We view it very simply, is we're just making tools for the developers, and how the developers use those tools, that's up to them. And so, we've seen a couple different ways of doing it, I think, right now. Part of the fun will be, go out 3 or 5 years, there will be a lot more different ways to use them that we hadn't had anticipated. Just look forward to it.
Okay, great. Well, I think that was a really interesting conversation with Mark and Mike here. And thank you guys for joining me here. But I think that's going to do it for Digital Foundry today. So thank you for joining me, and goodbye.